Start. Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. This is Sharon Kyle joining you. And along with me, I have Robert Jensen. And Robert is an author. He's a retired professor. Let me give his actual. I'm going to go look at his bio. He's an emeritus professor in the School of Journalism and Media and at the University of Texas at Austin, and a founding board member of the Third Coast Activist Resource Center. He collaborates with New Perennials Publishing and the New Perennials Project at Middlebury College. Is that still true?
That's all relatively true, yes.
Oh, great. And you're so gracious to offer content to the LA Progressive, and you do that quite frequently, and we really appreciate it.
Well, I discovered the LA Progressive through a friend 2 or 3 years ago, and was just blown away by the range and the quality of what you all do. So I'm grateful you're out there working so hard.
And we know when we touched base with each other for the first time, I was surprised that you remembered Dick and I, because we'd come to you had a book tour, and we attended. That was many years ago. And you
many years ago, when there were still book tours for authors like me. Those don't exist anymore. So.
You're right. They don't. But what was interesting to me, and it's one of the reasons that we went to the book tours, I'm always interested when white people, especially white academics, speak on, teach on, write on the topic of racism. Yeah. Because it's just not that common. I'm actually writing a piece. I wrote a piece this morning that's going to be on the LA Progressive, which talks about the invisibility of whiteness, because whiteness is generally not racialized. Yeah. And so when we're talking about race, we're not talking about whiteness. Yeah. We're talking about those brown people, those Black people, the indigenous people. So when I find a white person doing that, writing about racism, I'm always interested in hearing your take on it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And whenever I think about that, I always want to remind myself that it was really one white guy I met when I was in graduate school who kind of showed me the way to do that. It's always good to remember that we're the product of the influences on us. And I consider myself very lucky to have come through graduate school in the beginnings of my political activity in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was a lot of very, not only progressive analysis, but people who'd been through struggles. And the gentleman I'm thinking of had been through those struggles, going back to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s in the South. And he had an experience that helped me understand that superficial academic analysis didn't cut it, especially when teaching. And if I can tell a quick story, I remember I taught an introductory journalism class. The department, perhaps misguided, allowed me to speak to 250 first-year journalism students every year and teach the introductory class. And a friend of mine named Pamela Newkirk, who's still teaching at New York University, had written a wonderful book about the Black experience in mainstream media and mainstream media coverage of Black America. And I used that book in my class, and I don't think students were expecting an intro class. And I always took one day right before we started discussing that book to talk about myself. And I got out from behind the podium, and I put a chair on stage, and I talked about my own failures. Not how I was such a great progressive white guy who understood everything. I talked about my own experience in media, things I'd done badly, and I think it was the people I learned from who helped me understand, if you're going to teach about this stuff, you better be self-reflective. And if you're white, being self-reflective means you better own up to your own failures. And I had the same experience in feminism. If I was going to teach about feminism as a man, I better start by recognizing my own failures, or else it was all kind of just an academic exercise. So I'm at that age where when people tell me things, it reminds me of things in the past, going back decades. So sorry about that.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. A friend of mine recently, a friend of mine who's white, former Catholic,
Mhm.
she is writing a book about interracial relationships. And I don't know, we didn't really have time to talk very much. We just sort of ran into each
Mhm.
other. And she mentioned that she's started this book. And she mentioned it to me, obviously, because Dick and I, my husband is white,
Yeah,
I'm Black.
right.
And um, I guess that's why it occurred to her to tell me that she was writing this book. But after we passed and I was going my way and she had gone her way, I was thinking, well, I don't know what her husband is and
Yeah.
why. I hope she's in an interracial marriage or has been
Mhm.
in one, because it's not something that you can write about just by doing
So,
research, I don't think.
yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. That reminds me of another, wise elder, although not much older than me, a professor at the UT law school I knew, Chicana. And one day we were talking. She taught critical race theory, and I was very interested in it. We became friends. She looked over at me and she said, I don't really trust white people if they don't have non-white friends, friends of color. And I stopped and I thought at that very moment, the only person I was really close to, I would call a close friend, was her. And it was like, yeah, you're right. Uh, it's one thing to read, it's another thing to live. And of course, reading and analysis and scholarship, it's all important. I've learned so much from, historians of race, for instance. But if we don't challenge ourselves, we're lost. And when I think of the Trump administration attack on critical race theory, or at least their bastardized version of what they believe critical race theory is, uh, it's not just that I think they're wrong. It's I think about what's lost. That invitation to white people to be critically self-reflective. I like to think at age 67, I'm a better person than when I was 27, when I started in on all this. I hope I'm a better person. I've learned something. But some of the opportunities I had are not going to be as easily available because of this reassertion of not just a kind of subtle white liberal, domination, but the reassertion of out and out white supremacy and overt racism. So uh, I'm lucky to have come up through the ranks when I did. Uh, and I think it's worth fighting to create that space for young people today.
That's right. It's really important that we do hold that space. So then that brings us to your article about teaching the transgender debate, journalism, academic freedom, and responsible reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And you start out, well, the subtitle is How Educators Can Navigate State Mandates, Cultural Conflict, and the Responsibility to Prepare Future Journalists for Difficult Conversations.
Yeah.
So you being a retired, you start off saying that you're retired from the University of Texas at Austin Journalism School for 8 years,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't stop thinking like a teacher. So, teacher, teach.
Yeah. Well, this article was prompted by some developments in Texas where professors were sanctioned, even fired, for teaching about what's generally called these days gender ideology, which I would describe as the ideological underpinnings of the transgender movement. Uh, of course, the state directives and the federal directives don't give a lot of guidance about what it means to say you can't teach gender ideology, because obviously the transgender debate is all around us. And how could a responsible teacher in, let's say, sociology or psychology or social work, or in my case, journalism, how could we be responsible teachers if we didn't acknowledge the controversies around us which affect our field? So it really can't be that the word transgender shall not be spoken in a classroom. That would be impossible. So I suggested that this is an opportunity to teach more deeply, because while I reject the Trump administration's approach to the gender question, I am from a category that's often called gender critical, based in a feminist critique, where I think there are real questions about the trans movement and its underlying ideology that need to be asked. So the article basically says, why not take this moment to to talk about that. And that's not always been easy. Before the Trump administration cracked down, I found that the problem in speaking about the transgender question in classes was that a liberal dogma about transgenderism couldn't be challenged. So I had friends and colleagues who criticized me for things I wrote critiquing the transgender ideology, for instance. So I said, let's take this moment and try to make sure at least we understand terms, definitions, because the thing I've noticed about the transgender debate, and I've never seen anything like this in my experience, is people argue about terms where nobody has a common definition. In fact, there are no common definitions available. So that's the starting point for the article.
And aren't those definitions changing?
Yeah.
For example, I'll give you an example. So I was raised by parents who were really young when they had me. They were teenagers, and I was their firstborn. And they didn't have a lot of the tools, conflict resolution tools, all kinds of stuff that you should have to be a good parent. They were great parents when it came to loving me. They loved me. There was no doubt about that. But there was so much that they needed help in. And one of those was conflict resolution, the conflict being between each other. So my mother's brother came to live with us. And he was just as young as they were.
Yeah.
But he was great at sort of keeping things calm.
Yeah.
He was also gay.
Mm-hmm.
He was also a transvestite.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was raised with that very much normalized in my home.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have language for all that stuff. He was just my uncle. And I kind of thought everybody had uncle like that. That's because you tend to think that whatever's going on in your home is going on in everybody else's home. And then it wasn't until, I was in my early teens, late getting into puberty, that I realized that his life was made difficult because he didn't conform to a certain way of being. But we didn't have that language. So today, I think he would have been called trans. He never had any kind of surgery, nor did he want it. Mm-hmm. He used the pronoun he sometimes, and sometimes he used the pronoun she. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what categories he would have fit in. He passed away in 1989 of AIDS. It was a very devastating loss for the entire family. So he didn't, I say that in 1989, he didn't get to experience all of this, pronoun declarations and all of the various expressions of gender that we have now.
Yeah. And of course, the issues have changed since then, because now it's a question of single sex spaces. Should men who identify as women be allowed into a women's changing room? Should they participate in women's athletics? So there's a whole bunch of complex and quite thorny social issues that weren't on the table back then. But, when you talk about the basic terms, I think we still are at odds or confused about how to use the terms sex and gender. So in the piece, I point out, sex is generally considered a biological question. It's a binary. There are male and female. There's a lot of, sophisticated, and I put that in quotes, argument that sex is a spectrum, but it's not true. Human reproduction is based on male and female, egg and sperm. And so we have an understanding of sex. Okay. Gender is the term that the feminist movement in the 60s said is a better way to describe the social expectations and norms that are layered on top of that sex difference. So sexual reproduction is a matter of biology. But whether women are, let's say, capable or qualified to be elected president, that's not a question of biology, that's a social question. And so gender expectations are different from sexual reality. But the transgender movement has really, I think, muddied the waters about that. So there's now an argument that gender identity, independent of sexual biology, is an innate and inherent quality. That you're not just born male or female, you're born masculine or feminine, and yet there's no clear articulation of what that means or explanation of it. And so things have gotten so confused. And if you look at some of the news coverage of it, They move between sex and gender as if they're synonymous. And so it gets very hard to even explain an issue when there's no common definitions. And I see this all the time. I talk to people when they find out I've written about this, they ask me. And one of the most common responses is, I don't even know what people are talking about. People who read the news, don't study the issue, maybe hear about it on TV now and then, are often very confused about even what the trans movement is claiming. And it's really hard to imagine resolving a public policy debate in a democratic way when there are no clear definitions and when the movement making claims doesn't feel obligated to make clear definitions. So as a journalism professor, I would be teaching about how students can ask those questions in a respectful manner and recognize that the transgender movement is more than just politics. It's people's experience. It's people's distress. The psychological category of gender dysphoria, where your internal sense of your gender is different than your biological sex. Well, that's real people suffering distress. Okay, so again, the problem with the Trump, sometimes people say, well, you support Trump. And I say, no, I don't support Trump on anything, including the cruel and callous way they mock people's distress. So it's one thing to ask critical questions that lead to democratic deliberation. It's another thing to be mean-spirited and use people as a political tool. So I really want to distinguish between the feminist influence critique I'm trying to put forward and the right-wing, often very religious sort of MAGA critique, which I don't think helps anybody.
Right. Well, so their critique certainly is not illuminating. And speaking
No.
of the definitions, what we've attempted to do here at the LA Progressive is provide a glossary.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the top of the menu on the LA Progressive, you'll see that there is a glossary. And I believe that we do include definitions for the various transgender or trans or the whole LGBTQIA alphabet.
Yeah. And some of those definitions are crucial. Let me give you another example. The term non-binary is very common these days. Well, that leads to an obvious question. Sex actually is a binary. Male, female, with a very small proportion of humans born with complicated, it's often called differences of sexual development. Sometimes the term intersex is used. But that's not a third sex. It's not another sexual category. It's anomalies in births, which happen in all organisms. Okay, so sex is a binary. What does it mean to say one is non-binary? Does that mean if I told you I'm non-binary, does that mean I'm claiming that I'm not actually male or female, or that I'm something else? Or does it just mean, listen, I don't like the social expectations that are put on male and female? Now, if it's the former, if by claiming I'm non-binary, I'm saying I don't fit a sex binary, then I don't know what that can mean. But if it's a dissatisfaction with gender norms, I know what that means. You know what that means, almost everybody, because nobody fits exactly the very rigid categories of masculine and feminine that patriarchal societies give us. Just to give you a very personal example, I was always the shortest, skinniest, most effeminate boy in my class. I didn't start growing physically till I was in high school. I was constantly terrified of being bullied because I didn't fit masculine norms. I was small and effeminate. All right, so I know from firsthand experience that those very, very rigid expectations put on boys and girls, men and women, are extremely dangerous. It felt literally very dangerous for me to not fit those categories. But it wasn't because I wasn't male. I wouldn't have said, if I'd had the language back then, I wouldn't have said, I'm not male. I would have said, I really don't like the expectations being, heaped on my shoulders. And most people have some experience of that. I used to say even the most macho high school quarterback, stud, you can imagine kind of the caricature of masculinity. Even those guys, I've learned through a lot of conversation, are often very at ease with some of the expectations on them, right? They know that that masculinity norm has constrained them at some level. So, almost everybody I know is unhappy with rigid gender norms. That doesn't make us non-binary necessarily.
Right,
It
right,
puts us in opposition with the system that creates those norms. And from my political roots, the system is called patriarchy, institutionalized male dominance.
right. But I think where the cloudiness comes in is when we confuse the socialization of
Mhm.
gender with the physiology of
Right.
sex.
Hmm.
So when you said that you were born small in stature and
Hmm.
effeminate, are you equating your physical being to being effeminate, or did you project in your gender expression
Hmm.
being?
No, I just knew that I didn't look like or act like the tough guys.
I
And
see.
I, we're talking about, let's say a 12-year-old boy in Fargo, North Dakota in 1970. Not a lot of language for this. All I knew is that there were these guys who seemed to be the norm, the model, and they were usually in the world I grew up in the best athletes and the strongest, the physically stronger. And I knew I didn't fit that. And I when I say I was effeminate, I just mean I didn't have those tough guy
I see.
characteristics. I was soft. I was a soft kid. I was a nerdy, book reading, soft kid. And that's fine. In a decent world, that's that range of personality types should be celebrated. But in
Well,
the
it was
world
in
of
New York City.
yeah, but in the world I grew up in, it wasn't. So I didn't have the language to explain what I was distressed about. But it wasn't distressed about my own body. It was distressed about the fact that I didn't seem to fit in to the category that everybody wanted me to fit in. Right. So, I have a story that's very common. My dad was a jock. He wanted jock boys. I was not a jock. I was not gifted athletically. And that's putting it mildly. I was never going to be a successful athlete. Yet that's fine. I was interested in books. I was interested in other things. But in that very narrow world, I had to cope with the fact that I didn't fit what I thought was the norm because everybody around me told me it was the norm. Feminism, as I understand it, starting especially what we call the second wave of feminism in the 1960s, was really a challenge to those expectations. Women were saying, listen, you expect me to be a certain kind of human being because I'm female. I don't buy it anymore. And of course, when women started to challenge those patriarchal gender norms around femininity, it created space for men to challenge the patriarchal gender norms around masculinity if we wanted to take up that challenge. And I'm grateful I knew people who helped me see that I had to challenge, just as I had to challenge racial ideas, I had to challenge sexual and gender ideas. And that's why I've always said feminism, is often interpreted by men as a threat. And to me, it was a gift because feminism helped me look back at my own upbringing, my own life, and realize there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just not a jock. I'm just not the studly guy, and there's a different path for me, which doesn't require me to pretend I'm not male. I'm a guy, but it allows me a way to challenge those really restrictive, repressive norms. And so I've been grateful to feminism for helping me find a path out of that patriarchal set of assumptions.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, so let's talk about the transgender, the topic of the article.
Mhm.
Give us what it took for you to explore that.
Well, I started to go back and give some context. I started my political and academic life in the feminist critique of pornography. Okay, now this goes way back for people
Oh,
who are old
this
enough
is
to remember.
so
Yeah.
this is wait, let me just break in a little bit
Yeah.
here. My daughter,
Uh-huh.
she went to Vassar, And this was an area that she studied quite, and she and I
Oh.
were always at odds. And I think it was because of the generational difference.
Yeah.
And so give me your interpretation of second wave feminism's take
Right.
on pornography.
Right. This is often called the radical feminist critique, which a term I don't use so much anymore because radical can mean so many different things to people. But these are people like Andrea Dworkin, the late writer, who really was at the center of this. And they were pointing out that pornography was not just sex on the screen in some harmless way. It was sex in the context of male domination and female subordination. And Andrea and other women of that era started to analyze both the content of pornography, what the pictures and the movies look like, and the experiences of the women in the industry. All right. And they made a critique. Now, when I first came upon that critique, I thought it was crazy because, of course, I was a guy who had used pornography and these crazy women didn't know what they were talking about. But the more I studied it, the more I realized, okay, they're spot on. They're analyzing this phenomenon in a very, very savvy way. And if we think about when that critique came out in the 1970s and then think about pornography today, well, I think it turns out they were absolutely right. If you look at pornography today, the male domination, female subordination, the cruelty, the callousness, and by the way, the overt racism, because people forget pornography is without a doubt the most racist media genre in the world. Really overt, ugly racism is part of it. Because in pornography, sex becomes a question of power and domination. And so it's men over women, it's sexualizing racism. The ugliness of contemporary pornography is really hard to capture. I'm tempted to say you have to see it to understand it, but I don't want people to look at it because it's actually, for a lot of people, very traumatizing to have to look at the images that so many men, and it's mostly a male product, of course, that so many men find sexually arousing. Right? But that was a bit of a digression. That's where I came up through that radical feminist critique. And as the transgender debate got more heated, there were women from my branch of feminism who were criticizing the transgender ideology. But it was also very tense because the liberal left had largely embraced trans ideology. And so some women I worked with challenged me and said, why aren't you writing about the trans debate? You're keeping your head down. You're not taking a position. You're playing it safe. And I had to acknowledge they were correct. So around 2014, I started studying and writing. And what I found is that most of my liberal left friends, were not supportive. They didn't want to debate. Either they agreed with the trans position, especially around things like trans identified men, that is, men who identify as women, that they supported allowing those men who identify as women in those single sex spaces like women's changing rooms or women's sports. And the movement I'm part of it rejects that. Okay. So the left liberal comrades of mine either agreed with the trans position or they were so afraid of taking a position counter to it that they wouldn't even talk to. I had actually had friends who stopped talking to me, I think out of a fear of guilt by association. Oh, you're a friend of Jensen's, and Jensen is part of the gender critical feminist movement that critiques trans. They were afraid of even being seen in public with me. Okay. I realize the debate is very contentious and independent of anybody's position. It's not a healthy intellectual or political climate when people are afraid to speak,
Right.
when people are afraid to even ask questions. And that's the situation.
So my question is the crux of the debate, does it really center around bathrooms? Or is it more to that?
Well, I think there are really two questions, and they're about safety and privacy. Okay. So most women, if I said, well, I'm going to use the women's bathroom, most women would say, no, you're not. You're a guy. Okay. And the reason is because those are spheres in which privacy is expected. Okay. And so I wouldn't be allowed into a women's bathroom as a man who identifies as a man. But if I am a man who identifies as a woman, should the rules change? That's the basic question. The other questions are about safety, all right? Because in spaces like changing rooms, bathrooms, or prisons, women's prisons, if men who identify as women are allowed in, then it's going to open up space for maybe men who actually aren't gender dysphoric. They don't really feel like trans, but they want to use that trans identity to get access to women. Now, the feminist movement warned about that years ago and was told, oh, that will never happen. But it is happening. There are documented cases of men who identify as women being allowed, for instance, to be housed in women's prison and then assaulting women, right? So when you take these questions of privacy and safety, it's not just an abstract question of can a man really be a woman? It's what about spaces in a patriarchal society where women feel a need for privacy and safety? The other issue, of course, is women's athletics. Women's athletics was created because there's a physical difference between men and women in things like, average height, speed, muscle mass. And for women to be able to compete and enjoy the benefits of athletic competition, it was understood there should be separate men's and women's categories, boys and girls. All right. Now, if I identify as a woman, should I be allowed to compete in that women's sport? Well, the movement I'm part of says no. It's not an easy question to understand or figure out, but women's sports exist for a reason. You can say the same things about women's colleges or women's scholarship program or anything was created to give women the ability to compete with men in a world that has always been, skewed toward male power. All right. Those are the kind of questions. And I'm not suggesting that people on the other side of the issue are evil. I'm not suggesting there's an obvious right or wrong answer. I'm suggesting that if we can't talk about it with clear definitions, we're lost. There is no public policy debate that can be settled democratically if people are afraid to speak, and when they do speak, they don't agree on even how to use basic terms.
Yeah. Well,
that's what I was arguing.
Here in Southern California, we have gender neutral bathrooms. Lots of our public bathrooms are, you can go in whether you're male or female and go into the same door. And occasionally people like me get mixed up.
Yeah.
And the last time I went to the men's room thinking that I was going into a gender neutral, I see all these guys and I did, hey, what's up? So then I just head on to the stall. I open up the stall door. There's a guy in there too. I'm like, would you hurry up? It's still not dawning on me that I'm in the actual wrong bathroom.
Well, let's take the bathroom issue because I think it shows how there can also be creative solutions. So if there is space in a facility, let's say a school, to create individual bathrooms where the door can be locked, those can be gender neutral, and it enhances everybody's privacy. Because as a friend once pointed out, when he was in school, he didn't like to go to the boys' bathroom because he was shy. Okay. So one solution is, when possible, to create individual bathroom stalls that have doors that lock. Fine. The problem is when you get to big institutions and facilities, think of a sports stadium, right, where there are going to be 40,000 people. There's no way to have a sports stadium that has adequate bathroom facilities in which each one has a lockable door. It's just not going to work. So in those things, you're going to have male and female restrooms.
Do you wonder if this then becomes a class issue? Because I can imagine that there are some areas of that stadium, the posh areas.
Oh, sure.
So
sure.
they expect the masses to expect different treatment than the wealthy.
Sure. So there are lots of creative solutions possible, but there may be times where we're stuck with male and female spaces, and there the questions of privacy and safety become relevant. All right. So we can't get to those creative solutions, and we can't decide on an outcome that everybody can agree upon, even if they're on the other side. Again, if we can't debate if people are afraid to debate. And when we do debate, if we don't have terms that people understand. And I I have to say, obviously, I think what I write makes sense. Not everybody agrees. But I would say whatever I've written about this, I've tried to be fair and to avoid the kind of language that typically comes from the right? The insulting language, the insults directed toward individual people who don't conform and all that. I don't see that as helpful at all. And what I'm trying to do is say, listen, there's an emotional reality to this debate that we can't ignore, obviously. We're dealing with people's sense of themselves, and that's not a purely rational discussion. But when we do discuss it as a policy issue, we can be as reasoned as possible. We can rely on evidence. We can think about, biology, not as a expression of some subjective understanding of the world, but a science that we understand. And unfortunately, as kind of neutral and straightforward as I've tried to be, I still get accused of being a bigot or being hateful. And I always ask people, can you identify any sentence I've ever written or spoken that displays bigotry or hatefulness? And nobody has. But, this is not the first issue that has created a rancorous debate, and it won't be the last. But as a teacher, I go back to my old profession. My job, I thought, as a teacher was to try and bring that kind of calm and reasoned approach to help students come to whatever decision they were going to come to. Not that they had to accept what I said, but at least I was trying to give them the tools to make an informed decision. And that's what I was trying to get at in the article that was at LA Progressive. That's my job. Not to dictate to all people the way to think. I wish people would listen, but they don't.
I know. And yet you still, even knowing that you will get some negative responses, you still have to put the information out there, because there are people who will benefit in a positive way from reading what you've written. I certainly am one of those people. So I really do appreciate you doing it anyway.
And let me go back and point out, this isn't unique to this situation. I taught in Texas, which included a large number of students who were from very conservative and often very religious households. And when I was teaching, if subjects came up in which I was putting forward, let's say, a secular account of a social issue, there would be students who said, well, the problem is you're not factoring in God's power to, and okay, what am I going to do? I don't happen to be a religious person myself, but that's not the issue. The point is, in a public classroom, right, we can acknowledge that some people bring spiritual beliefs that affect how they're going to understand the issue. Other people will bring exactly the opposite beliefs. And the goal is, where is the common understanding, right? So I might tell a student, you believe in revelation on this, but we live in a secular democracy, and revelation can't be what decides a public issue. We have to find common ground, common language. And so it's on his or her shoulders to articulate their beliefs in a way that others can hear, just as people who are secular should recognize that spiritual or religious folks are in a sense talking a different language, and there has to be that. So this is not unique to the racial debate or the sexual debate. This is the fact that, as I used to always jokingly say to students, remember, there's a lot of individual variation in the human species. We're not all the same. We don't all believe the same things.
And might I add, not just the human species, the entire animal kingdom.
Yeah. So, I would also always follow up by saying, and it's a good thing there's a lot of individual variation. Otherwise, it would be a very boring life. Right? So what I tried to do is not run away from conflicts in class. And I think sometimes teachers, whether it's at the lower levels or the university levels, think that the responsible way to teach is to avoid conflict. But I actually disagree with that quite strongly. I think because we're professionals, because we have both training and a certain amount of status, It's our job to model for students how to deal with conflict. Right? So take climate change. I'm a believer in the scientific consensus that climate is changing, the planet is warm. Okay, right? I had students who didn't believe that, right? And sometimes they would be very vocal about that. My job wasn't to say, okay, you don't believe in climate change, I do, let's move on. It was to say, okay, again, in the context of teaching journalism, if you're reporting on ecological issues and there is this scientific consensus, how do you approach, accurate, fair, responsible reporting on that? What are we going to do about that? Right? So conflict, it's understandable why people can be conflict averse, because some people just don't like the tension. And maybe I'm a bit odd this way, but I always found that tension very invigorating. And part of that is because the only times I ever really learned is when someone challenged me and created in me tension. The really important shifts in my own thinking, especially around questions like race and gender, came when somebody I trusted, somebody I respected, challenged me and said, listen, you're wrong about that. Right? And instead of saying, oh, well, okay, we disagree, let's move on, we would wrestle with that. And I think that is at the core of good teaching, is helping people wrestle with conflict, not avoiding it. And of course, it's important to say these days, when I say wrestle with conflict, I don't mean violently, right? Because unfortunately, too much of that, of those disputes are now being dealt with through either overt violence or threats of violence.
So what you are a proponent of is actually a way to mitigate these violent outbursts,
Yeah.
because I think the violence comes from an inability to reconcile these differences, to challenge yourself, to stretch, to grow. When you don't have opportunities to do that, it can get bottled up and become what we're seeing.
Right. And that's why, free speech is so essential, because there are, of course, always constraints on speech. I can't libel you. I can't say something false and defamatory about you without consequence. There's all sorts of restrictions on speech, and there always will be. Sexual harassment law is a restriction on speech. If you were my employee, I couldn't sexually harass you through words. And I think that's a very good thing. So we don't want to pretend that free speech is this simple yes or no question, but to create the most expansive space for speech that allows people to resolve conflicts through intellectual, which also often has an emotional component. We're not just calculating machines, but intellectual dialogue is crucial. And I don't know of anything more central to university teaching than that. And there have been people who want to shut down that debate for all sorts of reasons, and some of them well-intentioned. So let me give you an example. There was a big debate starting in the 1990s, about the time I started teaching, about hate speech codes. Should, in a university setting, a professor be disciplined for saying something racist? And one response would be, no, she has free speech, can't restrict it. But that's too simplistic, because imagine you were a student in my class, Sharon, and I constantly belittled Black people in my class. Well, that's not just my free speech. That's creating a hostile climate, which is going to make it very difficult for you to learn. If every time I open your mouth, you wonder if I'm going to make a crude racial joke, you're not going to be able to learn at your capacity. So when you get from a kind of abstract defense of free speech to the real world problems that come, right, it gets sticky. And that's why free speech law, which I studied, was always so interesting to me. I used to tell my media law class, where we discussed these things, that this would be the most exciting class they ever took. Not because I'm such a great professor, but because the question of where do we draw the line between speech that might harm but still is free versus speech that harms and we need to constrain. That's a really fascinating question. We don't have an easy algorithm to answer it. The question has been answered differently at different times in US history. it's answered differently in different parts of the world. It's just one of those things. The conflict is inevitable around it, but man, it's exciting. I used to get uh, kind of all worked up about these questions because not because I thought students needed to understand how important they were, but because even 30 years after I started studying them, I still got excited about it, and I still get excited today. Uh, to me, the fundamental free speech questions in a democracy are endlessly interesting and will engage me till the day I die, I sure.
Yeah, I find them very interesting as well. For many years, more than a dozen years, I was on the board of the ACLU.
Yeah,
And let me tell you, we engaged in a lot
yeah,
of very
yeah,
interesting, deep discussions on these matters.
yeah, yeah. And the ACLU, there's a good example. The ACLU was very critical of the anti-pornography stance that feminists took, the feminists I learned from, right? Uh, and so I'm a free speech advocate, but I was not always in line with the ACLU position. Does that mean I think the ACLU people were evil? No. If there were people of conscience who engage in good faith attempts to understand complex issues, inevitably will come to different conclusions. I can't imagine a world where that doesn't happen.
Mhm.
And unless you suppress people's right to speak about their conclusions, right, you're going to have that conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the thing that I learned from being a part of that body for so long is that you can take a group of people, share the same exact information with them,
Mm-hmm.
and then come out with various interpretations of that information.
Yeah.
Because a lot of how you interpret has to do with the lens
Yeah.
that you see through, through your life
Yeah.
experiences, your
Yeah.
education. As long as you can formulate an argument that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I found. Even those who fell on the different side of an argument than I did,
Mm.
I always understood why
Yeah.
they were taking the position that they took, because they were able to explain to me why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yet I still held mine.
Yeah. And that's why this article I wrote about teaching the trans debate seems important to me, because my own experience over the last dozen years has been that people who are supportive of the trans movement or are trans themselves or embrace what I would call that underlying ideology of the trans movement, they haven't wanted to engage often. They've wanted to shut me down. And that still goes on. I sent the article that we're talking about to some friends in journalism education. And I said, can you help me identify people who might want to read this? And one of those friends, who I know agrees with me, but is very nervous about it, said, I don't think this is going to be well received in our field, and I'd rather not get involved.
Mm.
So you see that even while the Trump administration is haranguing and harassing people in the trans movement, people in the trans movement are also trying to shut down a certain kind of debate in left and liberal circles, right? And so that leaves you with, you're either MAGA or you're pro-trans. Well, what if I'm not MAGA? I'm not pro-trans. I have a feminist-based critique. Where do I go to even articulate that? The MAGA people don't want to hear it because they don't like the feminism, right? And the trans movement doesn't want to hear it because it's critical of some of their policy demands. And so there's this real kind of silence, I think. And it's not just people who come at it from a feminist critique like I do. As I said before, it's ordinary people who just don't know how to make heads or tails of the issue,
Yeah.
who don't understand. They want to be kind and compassionate because that's the kind of people they are, but they don't understand why a boy who's gone through puberty and then identifies as a girl should be able to, swim on the girls' swim team. That doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't seem fair. So that compassion and that sense of fairness are in conflict because there's so little public conversation that's productive.
Yeah.
And I always want to make it clear, I've been critical of much of the trans movement's rhetoric, their underlying ideology, their policy demands.
So
I'm
you
not
need to be specific, aside from the bathroom and the sports.
Yeah.
Is there,
Well,
is there,
the two main ones are single sex spaces. And so we mentioned bathrooms, we mentioned changing rooms, the showers after high school gym class, something like that. And then women's prisons, right? Places where privacy and safety are big issues, right? The other, sports, is the most obvious one because almost everybody embraces the idea of separate sports for women to give women an opportunity to have that experience. Right? And so that's become a big one. But here's other ones that have been questionable or have been questioned. What about all women's colleges? Right? Some women choose to go to a female-only college for that sense of safety, privacy, and perhaps solidarity. Should men who identify as women, what are commonly called trans women, be accepted into all-female colleges? It's an interesting question, right? It doesn't have some of the same safety issues, perhaps, but it does speak to, in a patriarchal society in which women constantly deal with institutionalized male dominance, right? Should there be female spaces that men are not allowed in? And this, of course, comes up even though race and gender are very different issues in a lot of ways, it comes up in the debates about race too. Should there be, let's say you belong to a professional organization, should there be a Black caucus? That is a place where Black people in the profession who are used to dealing with white supremacy can come together and have conversations among themselves. Well, I'm supportive of that. If I all of a sudden was a white guy who identified as Black, should I be allowed into the Black caucus? Right? That's the analogy. And so these issues can be seen as analogous to race sometimes, although because race and sex are so different, sex is a biological category. We know race is a social category. So they're not exactly analogous. But these are the kinds of questions we have to be able to ask. And too often they're suppressed, either from the right, which says we don't want to talk about any of this, don't speak. For instance, in the state of Texas, the governor saying, don't speak of this in the classroom. Hard to understand how anything is going to get resolved. From the left position, the trans movement has often tried to push arguments like I'm making out of the conversation also.
yeah.
And I don't think that's productive. So I'm stuck in the middle, in a sense, between two political formations that both want to control the way the conversation goes. And I don't think that's intellectually healthy, and it's certainly not healthy for a democracy.
I agree with you. Robert Jensen, thank you for spending some time with me today. And for people who are interested in reading the article that we've been referring to, it's on the laprogressive.com. The title is Teaching the Transgender Debate, Journalism, Academic Freedom, and Responsible Reporting. Robert Jensen, it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been mine as well. Thank you, not only for this conversation, but for all the wonderful work you're doing at LA Progressive. Very, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Great.
Have a great one.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.